the role of civil society, of youth movements, of organizations like yours that really put the pressure on leaders and that speak the truth and speak truth to power and really raise the alarm bells in terms of the urgency, that we absolutely need that. Hi, so my name is Martina Donlon, and I am leading the climate communications team at the UN Department of Global Communications here in New York. I come from a journalism background, have worked in various capacities in journalism and also a bit in diplomacy, and have ended up at the UN at sort of the crossroads of international affairs and communications in this job that I enjoy very much, and have focused on climate for the last 4 years or so. And working closely also with the Secretary General's office to really support his policy asks and his objectives for the organization to tackle this global challenge.
Great. I think it's the first time that we've ever had a UN representative come to join a conversation with us. So we're very grateful for your time. I think we're living in such an extreme time of fast change. Not, I used to say that because of the climate impacts and the science and everything else, but now obviously politically, globally, technologically, feels like everything's moving very quickly. So some of the things I want to talk to you about today include kind of how those things intersect, but also perhaps what the context of the recent American election sort of really means, particularly through the climate lens. And then I suppose because of that being such an important sort of factor in the climate conversation, there's also a few other points for us around how global communications have been affected and climate communications have been affected, because that's kind of the focus of our discussion. So first of all, what do you see as the resulting impact of Trump's withdrawal from the Paris Agreement again, and the impacts on other things like the WHO? What do you think this change sort of means for all of us?
Yeah, I mean, having the largest economy in the world pull back from global agreements and frameworks definitely is a setback for our work at the UN. But in the context of climate change, and the climate agreement and the Paris Agreement in particular, let's not forget there are 194 other parties to the agreement, and they remain parties and they remain committed. And so I think it just puts more focus on that coalition that is still there and that is moving forward in the right direction. And it opens up avenues for new leadership, for new ways of showing what real leadership is, and for us to support that. And by that I mean, showing what the Paris Agreement has delivered and will continue to deliver, be it in terms of actually bending the global warming curve slightly downward from, a trajectory of more than 4 degrees of warming by the end of the century to now less than 3 degrees, still far from enough, but definitely it shows that collective action has made a difference, and we want to keep pushing in that right direction. And at the same time, let's not forget all the transformations that the Paris Agreement has unleashed. The renewable energy revolution, with wind and solar now being the cheapest new forms of electricity, with over $2 trillion invested in clean energy last year. More, almost double what's invested in fossil fuels. So those transformations are happening. Those have been unleashed, and those are unstoppable. And we're seeing the rest of the world, moving in the right direction, and want to, in our communications, very much highlight the importance of that leadership and moving in that direction for each country and for the world.
So, I mean, there's been a lot of concern, I think, in the climate movement that, the Paris Agreement was a huge achievement, and still, in this country, at least, we've seen this sort of backwards and forwards from the government to the courts. It's like, it's an agreement that we said we would meet, but also it's not legal. There's no sort of enforcement that we can do. And then we've had cases where the British court system has said, actually, for example, a government legislation that says they'll definitely expand an airport then gets found by a higher court to be illegal because it doesn't consider Paris commitments. So at that point, a lot of people in the climate space go, that's great. Perhaps there is some way of enforcing these kind of limits on carbon emissions. And then it goes back up to another court where they say, actually, we think that it can pass. And then it's back on the table again for more expansion. I'm very conscious that my position in the UK is the place where I understand what's happening the best. And I have less knowledge of how the sort of technical aspect of this plays out elsewhere. I mean, do you think that, for example, the cost of renewable energy being so low is something that by itself can do a lot of the heavy lifting internationally? And if so, is that a communications issue that needs to be won? Because in this country, at least, I don't know if you know much about the British press, but you wouldn't know that renewables are cheaper if you just read the newspapers, let's say.
Yeah, we have to do a better job, perhaps, in highlighting those trends and the benefits that it brings to people, right? And that's actually very much the direction we want to take in our communications, is highlighting the opportunities and the benefits that this clean revolution brings. Economic growth, better jobs, better health, better, livable parks, green jobs, etc. It is really the motor and the engine for growth and for not locking yourself into aging, polluting, expensive technologies now, but actually getting on board with the technologies and the momentum that is there, and that will bring huge benefits to people and to countries. So our challenge is to, try to speak more to also how it's in each country's national interest to get on board with climate action, because it brings these benefits for people, and countering that narrative of that it's some kind of expensive elitist thing, but in fact, no, it is for people. It is for us and for our grandchildren, and so it's that kind of narrative. And while at the same time, recognizing that Paris Agreement is a very flexible and carefully negotiated treaty, right? That actually allows every country to determine its own pathway. So it's not like we're prescribing one pathway. Like, that's really important, because there are also forces out there that say, the globalist elite is telling us what to do. No, the Paris Agreement actually very much allows each country to determine how much emissions they want to cut, how much financing they want to allocate for mitigation, for adaptation, how they're moving ahead in this pathway. The only obligation that it does put on countries is to actually move forward with it step by step, and to report every 5 years on how they're increasing their emissions, increasing their ambition, increasing their emissions cuts. So that is that ratcheting up mechanism that is built in. But it allows every country to go at its own pace to a certain extent, with the goal of globally, reaching the agreed targets.
Okay, so if that's the case, and then everyone is free to sort of decide, how they respond and what's appropriate to them, because of the sort of failure of this work to actually lower emissions and the emissions being higher, every year so far, and going up again last year, as I understand it, as a sort of global situation. Are there conversations in the world that you live in, which is very different to the sort of place where I live and work? Are people talking about what to do about the unenforceable kind of nature of these things? Because obviously it's great if everyone democratically decides how to live up to the needs, but it does seem that there's quite a few players who've always been involved who try not to allow progress or try to prevent the wording that would create the the alignment and the agreements. And now that we've got America pulled out, is there a discourse in the sort of world that you inhabit about what that challenge really means?
Well, definitely, and it goes back to the science, really. In the end, that science tells us how much greenhouse gas emissions need to be cut, and it also implies how bigger economies having to do more, smaller economies less. The most vulnerable, such as small islands, again have their own pathway, and the G20 are really responsible for about 80% of global emissions, right? And that's where we're focusing most of our attention in getting really strong cuts in polluting emissions from the biggest emitters. So the UN is always, going back to the science by the IPCC, by other entities that we have, like UN Environment Programme, World Meteorological Organization, etc., that deliver that scientific basis for the action that we're asking for. And then there's diplomacy, behind the scenes. There is work with countries on the ground. The UN Development Programme is very active, helping developing countries develop their own national action plans. And this year there's a lot of focus on these national action plans that we need to see, right? Because this is one of the years, every 5 years, where we want to see these updated plans, where we want to see how countries are increasing their ambition and their targets. So a lot of work is being done by the whole UN system to really put that pressure on countries to live up to what they committed to in the Paris Agreement.
Yeah. But I guess from the climate movement perspective, I think, what Antonio Guterres has said to us, which has been very helpful, is that, people need to hold their governments to account. We've certainly tried to be part of doing that. And in some ways, I guess, the strength of the movement here has made quite a big difference, I think, not least Extinction Rebellion came out and said 2025 was a legitimate target to have, a 7-year time frame to try and aim at very quick decarbonisation. And I know that in a communications sense, saying 2025 made it much more possible for trade unions, NGOs, for other people to come in and say, actually, 2030 is a legitimate kind of place to aim. Whereas before, everyone was saying, 2050. And then most people sort of arguing over whether or not you could say 2040 or whether or not that made you like some kind of an extremist. And that use of the number or the language in that way, I think helped us very much to say, you have to do things now, not in 20 years' time. You can't push anything away down the road. You have to do things now in order to meet a very near-term date. So, I mean, do you think that, just staying on that topic of kind of unaccountable global power dynamics and capital and people making very nice money out of the fossil fuel industry and so on, that there is some discussions to be had about how we're able to sort of move things through collective kind of action and people power, and also through realizing that actually the space that was created by Extinction Rebellion saying 2025 was space that other people could come into who weren't us, but would come in from a different position to be able to take a more a view that they should be moving much quicker and that things should be moving and changing like sort of straight away in order to see some serious change happening. Because I'm curious about how the timelines for this seemed, over my lifetime anyway, to get stretched and stretched and stretched. I always said, when I was younger, people said you have 10 years to deal with climate. And then 10 years later, they said, we've got 10 years to save the climate. And 10 years after that, they said, we've got 10 years left. And I was like that with my head in my hands going, it can't, like, this can't work because it's not an elastic band. So in terms of us going, shortening everything like that, is there something that's perhaps that can be done or that has been missing from the dialogue or from the rhetoric and from the targets and the way people talk about this stuff in terms of like the near term changes that need to happen? Because I know Antonio Guterres has said to us, that we need to hold people to account, but he's also said things about, needing to fundamentally transform the economy everywhere. And that's not, that isn't really an ambition that I think you can see in sort of hardly any place, in terms of the scale of change that's needed. So I'm just wondering how, given that we lack an instrument of, top down, accountable, everything, do you think there's an expansive potential in using different language and for people to be more aligned around some of the sort of more urgent kind of language?
Definitely. Yeah, no. And I think the role of civil society, of youth movements, of organizations like yours that really put the pressure on leaders and that speak the truth and speak truth to power and really raise the alarm bells in terms of the urgency, that we absolutely need that. And that has been extremely helpful over the years. And the Secretary General has repeatedly said, shout out to the NGOs, to the youth leaders, like, we can't do it without you, keep going, we need you. That is, and we'd love to see even more of that now. We need that more than ever, I think, a global movement for change, a real bottom-up movement for change, because at the UN, we deal mostly with our member states, so with the governments, and we really need that grassroots bottom-up pressure, absolutely. And we're trying in our communications to speak more to people, to speak more to also private sector leaders, to NGOs, to influencers who in their respective sectors can drum up that support. Because without that, we're not going to get the leaders to actually lead and change. So it's very much a part of our communication strategy, I would say, is to create that bottom-up or to support that bottom-up pressure that you and others are leading. But to provide sort of the policy direction, again, that we're taking also from the scientists first and foremost. But we can never let up on the urgency, as you point out. And yes, these are giant transformations that are needed in economies, and those will take a bit. But we also need very immediate changes, very immediate action, because the climate action can't wait, right? We've already been saying we have 10 years, we have another 10. Well, we're really running out of time. And I think our Secretary General has made that very clear in his speeches. He's the first to really say it as it is and put the pressure on leader. But it only works if we also have the grassroots pressure. And we're seeing that also, for instance, the climate COPs at the conferences, when there's demonstrators, when there's civil society there, even just standing in front of the conference rooms with the banners during the last minute negotiations, it does make a difference. Those voices need to be heard, because in the end, it's the people that the leaders are accountable to. And let's not forget that actually we know there's a large majority of people who want climate action, who want their governments to act. Right? There are polls that show like 89% of people worldwide really want their governments to do more on this problem. It's sort of been a silent majority in a way, but we know climate action is not unpopular. In fact, healthier environments, greener jobs, etc., is something people like. We just need to maybe sell it better and really get the voices out there. And at the end, that's hopefully what will get leaders to move in the right direction.
Yeah, well, so I'm glad you said that, because I've often gone out and said publicly, the problem is that our government is just wasting the opportunity before it to use the desire of the public to tackle the climate crisis to actually do that work, because it has huge support here. And particularly around the time when we launched XR, sort of soon afterwards, we'd done this big sort of rebellion shutting down London, parts of the city, and, you know, lots and lots of people doing quite disruptive protests. And we saw this massive spike in the concern for the issue, and almost like a reframing of it as well towards like this is an existential issue, which I think was, you know, lacking somewhat in terms of a lot of the sort of mainstream climate communications were quite incrementalist messages. And the awareness in the UK has remained very high, and the desire for political action has remained very high. But we've got, I mean, I mentioned the press before. The media here is deeply unhelpful on this front. And equally, we've got lots of issues throughout society with people who, you know, some people who were just on trial recently with Just Stop Oil were told by a judge, like, well, I'm too busy being a judge to really understand the climate science. So I don't really understand with any depth the arguments that you're trying to make, but also I'm not going to listen to them because they're not part of this case. They're not relevant. And I think a lot of people in our movement are deeply frightened when they meet members of society who are in such positions of responsibility and authority and power, who will very openly say in a public forum like that, I don't really understand this issue, because it's not like you say, it's not arguable at all at this point that it's happening, that it's us, that it's very, very serious, that we've already put it off too long. And in a way, I think we look at this context and layer on top of it in the global communications landscape a kind of capacity for disinformation, which is relatively new, and lots of people are talking about the problems with it. A good comparison for the emergence of the internet is to look at the emergence of the printing press. So one of the biggest things that got printed in Britain at that time was basically a nonsense booklet that said, this is how we spot witches so that we can, like, you know, deal with them in whatever way. And in some senses, I think that's an interesting comparison to say you've got the freedom to print whatever you like, but it just happens that one of the most popular things and one of the most printed things is total rubbish, which also is extremely dangerous and causing this sort of enormous harm. So I just wonder, from your position, like, you must have like analysis on the global communications landscape and trends and regulations and algorithms and fact checking or friends notes or whatever they're doing in, you know, Silicon Valley and all that sort of space. But what are you seeing in terms of like mis and disinformation, the challenge of communicating stuff on this front, and, you know, whether there are other routes that don't depend on billionaires and Silicon Valley?
Yeah, it's definitely a challenging environment. But in a way, it's nothing completely new in the climate space, because we've been dealing with fossil fuel interests, you know, sponsoring campaigns to delay or derail climate action for decades, right? So that's nothing new. But in recent weeks, I think we've seen, you know, the abandonment of fact-checking and other trust and safety mechanisms on the digital platforms that are certainly emboldening those forces even more, and putting us even more at a disadvantage, I would say, when the algorithms have never really been in our advantage and maybe are now even less so. So we definitely are at a disadvantage, you know, from a starting point. Like, so we can blame ourselves for not maybe communicating or speaking to the people the way we want or we should. But in the end, as you point out, it's really the landscape and the architecture of those platforms right now is just not in our favor. And also the dollars, we don't have that amount of dollars to spend on ads or lobbying or PR. In fact, we have no dollars to spend at all. So it's kind of a David versus Goliath situation. And yeah, we are looking at that landscape. We have people that are way more expert than me in this, on our social media team, our information integrity team, that are looking at this. But what we've tried to do in one initiative we've launched, a couple of years ago actually now, but that we're really also continuing this year, is this idea of finding trusted messengers. And we've worked with our partners at Purpose on this, to find trusted messengers that may be like micro-influencers on social platforms, but that have a good following, be it, in the spaces of cultural, sports, or science, or Indigenous people, or from different walks of life, but that can influence their communities and help create that, positive movement that we were talking about before. And that can also grow those movements and get new people to engage. Because one problem we have is that we're sort of in our echo chamber, right? Reaching the same people over and over. But through finding new types of messengers, we are hoping to then, reach into more communities that are receptive to these types of messages, and that can help us build that bottom-up support. So that's one thing we're doing, sort of at the micro level, at the grassroots level. At the same time, we still have our communications campaigns that really lay out the science and the actions, and always with a framing of sort of solutions and hope. Because there are lots of studies out there, right, that show that if you just communicate doom and gloom, and we know we have to keep up the pressure on the urgency and of the situation, absolutely. But people will switch off at some point. It's too much. If you do provide that hopeful message that solutions are there is momentum in the right direction. Here, the benefits and opportunities of this green revolution, get on it, be part of it. This is exciting. It's moving. It's working. It's the future. It's a future for your children. That kind of messaging works a lot better. And so that's sort of the angle we're trying to take. Hoping that we can break through all the other noise on the platforms and beyond. But as you say, it's not just the digital platforms. We have to think about the traditional media. Radio in many countries is a very powerful medium. And even maybe face-to-face, in-person gatherings, as you say. And we've been doing some of those as well, bringing together scientists, thought leaders, to really generate and energize sort of the movement with new fresh ideas. We just have to keep up the hope, I think, and the hopeful frame in this time.
Okay, well, that's really a helpful thing to say, because on my list of points is this question about doom and doomism. And I think people who know me will know that I'm the person who says, like, no, I'm not a hope person. I'm a kind of create your own reason for hope by being active and effective. And so I can't remember who it was who said that, in this situation, you have to like earn hope. One of the original things that we had in some of our stuff when we started the movement was this phrase, hope dies, action begins. It was very much like a motivator for people to say, actually, do you know what? Nobody is actually doing what they're supposed to be doing. The government isn't doing what it should be doing in the light of this information. The business sector isn't doing it. Where's the church? What's going on? Why isn't everyone like rallying together in this kind of emergency? Like, we have to transform everything for our own good and for our future and everything. Why aren't people doing that? And we said, well, you know what? We need to encourage people to kind of let go of what I think is often people have said to me that in many other languages, there are different types of hope and there's lots of different words for different hope. And in English, it's quite unhelpfully, we've just got one. And I think it sort of translates as like, oh, we just sit there and sort of cross our fingers and hope that somebody solves it or somebody else is going to make it so okay. At the same time as kind of needing to have a more sophisticated conversation about what that hope word is and what it can mean, there's the other end of it, which is the doism accusation, which I think has also been a major part of climate discussions for, particularly for communicators, saying, well, actually, you're being a doomer and therefore you're being unhelpful and therefore I'm now kind of in conflict with you. And we've seen this kind of play out on the internet, in Twitter, in social media platforms, and also on the sort of, interviews with climate experts who are variously either saying, hope, 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 or you're a bad person, or some other people saying, I'm looking at the worst possible end of the risk spectrum, and I'm telling you that it's not a risk that you can afford to take ever. And we've already taken many steps towards it. So actually, in terms of speaking out on like the extreme level of risk, you then kind of have what I call sort of noise cancelling messaging. So you have one expert saying the risk is too big and you should be paying attention to it. And then the other end, you had someone saying, no, don't frighten everybody. We need to talk about optimism and lift people up. So, I mean, have you noticed that conflict is an issue in the field? And I mean, I've always wanted to try and do something about it myself, because I think there's a lot of people who get sort of written off as being too miserable. But they're actually bringing forward something that's very important to listen to. And it feels a shame to me that we have sometimes some elements of the discourse that kind of push against each other in a way which amplifies the kind of notion of uncertainty, which obviously the uncertainty as the principle of the scientific method has been like the Achilles heel of the whole conversation, where the opposition and the bad actors and the fossil fuel industry will always say, well, you're not sure though, are you? And that's always been their sort of thing to get something in, and, they go in that crack and they cleave it open and they use that space like they did with tobacco to kind of weaken all of the conversations. So in terms of finding more agreement and alignment in terms of this hope versus doom kind of dilemma, or I would say a false dichotomy, have you had lots of conversations about this from a UN communications perspective?
Yes, I can say that is part of my daily dilemma in our jobs. This is very much something we debate, but in the end, I don't see it as a irreconcilable dichotomy. In fact, I see it more like two sides of the same coin, right? We have to point out the dire situation. We have to point to the science, the facts, the data that show that we are in a really bad spot and it's not looking good. And that we have to point that out. I mean, that is our moral and professional responsibility to point that out. On the other hand, we have to provide avenues for action and hope and solutions. Otherwise, we're just stuck in the dire place, and that serves no one. And the problem and the risk with the doom and gloom messaging is that people feel it's too late. Nothing can be done. It's too late to act. And that is not helpful, because then that paralyzes people, right? And paralysis is the last thing we want. We need movement. We need action. So we need to show the doom and gloom, but we need to provide that positive view for, well, what can be done and how can it be done and how is it already happening? And so that is where we want to focus our attention, especially right now, because there's so many things going on right now that can be a little disheartening and depressing, but we need to show where there still are moments of light and positive examples of leadership. Even in the United States, there are mayors, there are governors that are really pushing forward, that are not letting up, and that are moving ahead with climate action. Climate action is not stopping in the United States. The market forces are pointing in the direction of renewables. That's where the money is. That's where the business is going. And we have no doubt that that's where the country will be going, because there's really no alternative. So let's work with those leaders that are moving. Similarly, in other countries, you have leaders that are very much on board, and we're trying to build those coalitions and really embolden those coalitions of countries, of subnational leaders, of CEOs, of grassroots organizations, of influencers around the world, to keep that momentum going. Because if we're just dwelling on the facts, it's depressing and nothing will happen. So the doom, has to then lead into action, and not to paralyze people and bore people and shut people off, but provide a sense of agency. The hopeful message needs to be there.
It's a version of what you've just described is what we did with the movement, which was to talk very plainly about the reality of the information that we've got in front of us, and the systemic nature of the problem, and suggest that what had been tried so far wasn't working at all, and that we needed to try something else, and then to offer an option of coming together in very large numbers to do something that felt new. It wasn't really new, but it was kind of new for the time and for the subject and everything else. It's been a real shame, I think, to see the sort of pandemic knocked action down, because obviously everybody got shut in their houses, but also prevented that face-to-face organising. So people had to very much go online to try and stay connected and organise things. And in terms of the context here, anyway, we have very high levels of polarisation. I'm sure you're feeling the impact of something like that in America, and lots of people elsewhere in the world are feeling that the forces of politics and social media and the sort of culture is facilitating somehow this kind of spiraling apart of people who really need to come together to listen to each other. Do you feel that there's something important that we should think about as a global sort of response in terms of people meeting in real life, which is not very global? It doesn't feel very global when you do that because you're just down the road. But in terms of polarization and the weaponization of the culture war that we've had in this country very, very badly, politicians involved very heavily in stirring up divisions, stirring. Do you think that there needs to be more of a conversation on a global scale about people meeting to understand each other's shared humanity almost, like to recognize the identity sort of wars that seem to be going on and the culture wars that seem to be going on, that actually we have a polarization issue here, which is making all of our work more difficult, and that people on the ground meeting in real life is so fundamental. Is there a global communications effort to be done to say to people, just talk to your neighbors, for God's sake? Start somewhere, speak to each other?
Yeah. I mean, as the UN, of course, our role is very much as a convener, bringing people together and bringing country representatives together to speak to each other in person. So we're doing that at the global level, fostering that conversation. I think even in this very polarized world, this is still the place where presidents and prime ministers come together and talk to each other. And that's actually pretty unique and pretty valuable space that the UN provides. And similarly, the climate conferences every year, some people ask, why are they still in person? Can't you do them virtually? Well, to your point, there's so much value in people meeting face to face, seeing each other's humanity, talking to each other. For these negotiations, it's just a must. Those have to be, in person. So that's one way the UN is providing that platform for people actually to meet and talk at the highest level. The more of the grassroots approach that you suggesting, I like that very much, and I think we should put out such a call. Maybe speak to your neighbor, listen to each other, share your concerns, and discover that we're all human beings with similar desires and wishes and needs. And this comes back to the polls that I was quoting before of almost 90% of people want climate action. We know that people want healthier lives. They want better jobs. They want a livable and safe planet for their children, etc. Those are all things that people like. They like to breathe clean air. They like to have clean water, right? No, I think no one would dispute that. So one problem with the climate communications perhaps is that we don't focus so much on those issues that affect people directly and that people care about. Instead, we often throw around terms like climate justice, adaptation. Doesn't mean much to the regular person, right? Perhaps if we spoke more about clean air to breathe, clean water to drink, cleaner nature for biodiversity to thrive, green jobs, safer and cheaper energy, and actual energy access for people in developing countries who still live in darkness, in some places. Well, almost everybody can put up a solar panel and actually get some electricity. There are solutions there. If we speak in those terms, I think we can bring out that shared humanity and maybe overcome those polarizations, which seem just out of place in a way. And if we bring it down to those issues, perhaps we can create that shared movement for action.
Yeah, and I guess it would be interesting to hear from you. What do you think are the secrets to sort of successful convening? So if you're bringing together senior politicians, ministers, presidents, all come into this space, and all of the global tension that exists that we can all see in sort of geopolitical everything, that those bodies kind of enter a room, and then how does the UN think of itself in terms of successfully convening people who, send their armies towards each other? But is it something that you've got like certain ways that work in terms of bringing people into a space together, getting people to have, I guess, like mature conversations with each other?
Yeah, I mean, the UN has been playing that role for the past 80 years, right? Of that role of a convener and bringing all countries together to talk to each other, even under the most difficult circumstances. And that's a pretty unique role. And there's really no other place in the world where this happens like that. And there's different ways. Of course, there are bilateral meetings, one-to-one discussions that happen. There are the really big fora like the UN General Assembly, where every single state has a seat and has a voice and a vote. And there's the Security Council that has, again, a more limited membership. So there are different fora, different bodies, different arrangements for those discussions to happen, from very small to very large, from televised to behind the scenes. And that's the daily work of the UN. It doesn't always make the news if, a conflict is avoided, for instance. That's not news, right? But there's a lot of work happening here that is really valuable for the world, I believe, and more valuable than ever, perhaps, right now.
Well, and do you think it would be helpful if it was in the news?
Yes, why not? that's the problem with the news. You cannot like report on something that didn't happen. So oftentimes those stories don't make the news. So what makes the news is the bad stories, the bad news. And I think that goes back to the more positive messaging we want to get out there. You know, this solutions journalism, right? Getting out those positive stories, because we know people are a little tired of all the bad news and they're actually craving some good news. So maybe we can do a better job at the UN of getting out the good news stories as well.
You probably have a very similar problem to us, which is that, you know, the drama is the thing that they can go after because it gets clicks, because it's like makes money. And obviously in this country, we have lots of problems with press ownership. There's a handful of billionaires who own almost all of our print media, and most of them don't pay any tax in the UK. Also, that there's lots of problems with the ownership, with vested interests, all of that kind of stuff. But beyond that, you've also then got the problem that if you do something as the climate movement, which is sort of friendly and unremarkable, let's say, that it's impossible to get any coverage. And so if we were doing 50% friendly, family, you know, fluffy things, and 50% people going out with signs and getting in the way and being annoying or whatever it is, the annoying part would be the only part that you would hear about. In our movement, we had, I mean, thousands of beautiful stories about things that people have done and nobody really knows about them. The asymmetry of that is just a sort of eternal it's such a big problem that you can't sort of get people to hear about the things that you do. And on top of it, we did a thing a few years ago called The Big One, which was trying to get all of the NGOs to come out with us. And it was quite effective. We had, you know, Greenpeace and Friends of the Earth, lots of Christian organizations, trade unions, youth groups, nature groups, climate groups, anti-fossil fuel groups. I mean, lots, like the whole sort of spectrum of what you might expect and some extra. And everyone came with their own little badges saying, you know, look at all of these people who've all come together. And we went to Parliament for like 2 days and there was a huge march. And there was even people with a sort of gazebo like stalls all outside Parliament. So it was all with permission. Police were there. Everyone was happy. Very nice. Almost got no media coverage. There was, I mean, I can't remember the numbers, but we thought there was probably over the course of several days close to like 100,000 people or something participating. It was a big push to try and get the biggest numbers ever. And the media were like, that's not a story. You know, it's a real, that issue is real, isn't it?
It's real. I mean, we also see that a bit sometimes in the speeches of our senior officials. We put in, you know, some positive messaging and some dire lines, and it's the dire lines that get the headlines usually. But we're really trying hard this year to break through with the more of the opportunity messaging and the positive messaging. Let's see. I don't know how to solve this. It's true. We're definitely seeing that. It's just, I guess, the way the media cycle, the news cycle is going. One advantage we have here is we also have correspondents from major organizations, news organizations that are based here at the UN, that have like resident coordinators that we can speak to face any day, actually. So we can have these conversations and perhaps, you know, find more fertile ground, perhaps. But then again, you know, media have their independence and they will do what they want and they will cover it the way they want.
Yeah. So I guess just to close, because I'm conscious of the time running out, the thing that I'd like to ask you about is kind of what the recent changes in American politics in particular, but also seeing that as part of a trend where, you know, Germany has just almost seen the greatest rise of the far right and the AfD in their sort of recent elections. The political sort of reality of trying to do climate action has become I think it's kind of, in some ways it's changed, and it's also stayed the same, right? In the UK, we've been very lucky to have climate as a non-partisan issue until quite recently. Really, a lot of climate legislation or environment legislation has been put in place in our country by the Conservative Party over history. And in other places, like particularly America, it's been sort of forced to become a partisan issue where perhaps many decades ago it wasn't. It was just some scientific information that we needed to deal with the reality of what was happening. But it's also now, because it sort of feels like climate and fossil fuel interests and everything have been swept up into the political arena in such a sort of heightened way. At the same time, somehow I feel like there's something in this narrative which often feels that it's missing, which is massively about peace. There's the connection between sort of climate action, democracy, and keeping peace. Do you have anything to sort of reflect on where the sort of peacemaking agenda or the sort of the narrative of the determination for global peace, or the need for peace, in fact, to be able to deal with the climate crisis? I mean, we're not going to do what we need to do if everyone's fighting each other. So what are you seeing as a sort of as a big picture on the sort of intersections between, you know, the downturn in democracy in lots of places and the sort of will towards authoritarianism and the climate and the kind of peace message? I feel there's some configuration of that goes back a long time. Sort of Greenpeace is the clue, green and peace. So it's not like new, but like there is something new about the circumstances, isn't there? So I'd just love to know what you think about where climate and peace and democracy sort of collide. What do you think about that?
Yeah, you're right. It's nothing new, but in this context, it's something worth perhaps communicating in a new way, and in a way that helps us overcome this view of climate as a partisan issue, because it is, but it shouldn't be, right? And speaking to the people, again, I think we need to take this opportunity to speak directly to the benefits that climate action brings, and not only for health, jobs, and the economy, but also for peace. So yes, we need peace to do climate action, but also climate action will help global stability and peace. And the case is not that difficult to make. Look at migration, look at, people losing their livelihoods, their homes, their crops. That creates instability that affects not only one country, one region, but can have ripple effects around the globe. Those are very interlinked issues. The climate, peace, security, stability, economic prosperity, everything's interlinked, but we have to communicate that in a way that people understand, without throwing around big terms, but really bringing it down to, if we put in place, if you take advantage of wind and solar in your country, you will be independent from importing fossil fuels from other countries. You will have energy independence. You will stand on your own feet. It will be cheaper. It will be more secure. It will keep you out of geopolitical instabilities. There's so many things we can communicate around just like solar energy, right? How that helps independence, stability, prosperity, etc. That's the case we need to make. And yes, painting that bigger picture of how it all fits together, it's a challenging thing to do. But that's what we're definitely, what I'm trying to do in my daily job. I think communicating around what the UN is doing and how really the local realities connect to the global realities, and where people fit in, and where leaders fit in, and what kind of leadership we need to get this done.
I know someone who's working in sort of think tanks and research space who has been studying and convening people actually around the kind of the research that came through Chatham House about cascade risk, doom loops, political kind of the problem with the lack of political attention to something because it gets offset by a disaster or a war. And I saw, certainly with the invasion of Ukraine, that, a lot of people in this country suddenly went, oh, well, we just need to do some more oil fields then, because now that's happening. We can't deal with climate change. We have to do this first. And this sort of offset of the importance of tackling emissions being something that can be put off again and again and again in a destabilized situation where people are going, well, there's always something more important to do. Therefore, we're going to prioritize this thing for defense and security because we really can't spend money on that right now because we've got something more pressing to deal with. And, I'm anxious that the potential for what he's been terming derailment risk, where you get derailed from your mission basically because of the forces that are around you, that's potentially something that we may need to get more people to think about and talk about, because like you said, there's no time left, and people are going to reprioritize based on immediate threat to life. So I'll be interested to see what comes in the coming months, because we're sort of living through quite a big, I don't know what the word is, adjustment to global circumstances, to put it politely. But what does it mean for people to be able to keep their eye on this issue when there's going to be this sort of more and more and more things coming at us from multiple directions? So it's not an easy task, is it, ahead of us?
Yeah, no, definitely not. And there's always the risk that the climate crisis is still seen as something down the road, in the future, but it's here and now, and it's becoming more and more visible, and it shouldn't be a choice between focusing on disasters or wars or focusing on climate. No, it's all interrelated, right, as you just pointed out. So, it's a big task ahead of us, but we're going to keep at it, and I'm going to have to stay hopeful that the world is moving in the right direction, that we have enough people, seeing what needs to be done and actually are committed to getting it done.
Great. Well, thanks so much for spending the time with us today. I really appreciate it.
Thank you.
I'm sure that the movement wants to also pass on a lot of gratitude for those doom-laden statements that Antonio has made over the years, because they've been extremely valuable to us, actually. So thank you very much.
Good. No, thank you so much. And thank you for all the work you are doing and all the support you're providing to this movement. We need you and everyone to keep going, and together we will hopefully move the needle. So thank you. Thanks for having me.